Okay, we're going to give a few more minutes, just as I know people may be struggling with technology and making sure everything's good. I want to make sure no one misses anything. We'll have all this recorded too, so we're going to give it about 4 more minutes and then we're going to get started. I see a couple people still logging in and saying they're having audio problems. We've not been broadcasting audio, but are now. I'm going to keep on talking. Maybe we'll throw some NPR up here just to keep it fun. Make sure that you can hear us. I see a couple people saying they don't have audio. Messages aren't going. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Today what we're going to be discussing is just kind of the culmination of a couple of months of getting ready for the Access 2.0 online assessment for English language learners. Steve Miesmer and I are here over at the Ed Center, and we'll be walking you through the training that is required by North Carolina. Before we get started, you've got 2 ways that you can provide feedback. The first form, the CCS feedback form, is the one that I've been sending out to you over the last month or so. If you have questions related to anything at school, the test, administration, that website, the bit.ly CCS Access 2, that will take you to that form. You will need to make sure you're logged into Cabarrus Apps. The second link is a Q&A for today's webinar. That is a Padlet. When you go, you'll be able to double click on the screen and begin writing anywhere. There's a help feature on the right hand side that is a question mark, and it'll give you some more information. We will be looking at that throughout the webinar and trying to answer those questions, but we'll answer those in line. I've already answered a couple for those of you who posted questions. The questions automatically come in as anonymous feedback. And if you want us to be able to follow up with you individually, please make sure that you include contact information with school, and name and email so that we can follow up. And we'll try to answer those in line as we go and later on throughout the day. Just to make sure that we've got the right people on the call today, this webinar is really only required for test administrators. The primary portion is what Steve's going to be going over today. As you know, any NC test administration for a state required test must require a NC DPI test training, and that's what the brunt of today will be. We will have this recorded so that you can come back and give this to a test administrator. It is the test coordinator's responsibility at the school to make sure any test administrator hears this live or the recorded version. Your test proctors, all they need to do is the online training via the WIDA US site, and anything you learn from this that you may want to share with them. And then we're going to come back and talk about roving proctors later. If you do not have test credentials or need to request them for anyone at your school, there's a link down at the bottom of the screen, bit.ly, access train me. And that's all lowercase. And you can put that in and we'll be able to upload that probably within the next 2 hours, and any of your administrators or proctors who have not been trained will get a link for that. So what we're going to do now is Steve has got a copy of the WIDA Access for ELLs 2.0 Policy and Procedures Training Manual. I've provided this a number of different ways for you, and I know that the physical copy was in the box of test materials that you've already collected from your schools. It's available online, and we'll make it available with the follow-up to this as well. I'm going to scroll through that. If you've got a copy of it, you want to grab it to do some highlighting. We're going to go through, and Steve is going to point out some specific things for you and some highlighted sections of this file as well.
Good morning, everyone. Of course, if you'll turn the page and go to page 1, we'll start with page 1. And of course, you get the overview of the test itself and why we have to administer this test. You can read through that. It's a required assessment that we must give to our ELL students. Going on to page 2, and toward the bottom of the page, it also talks about the fact that we are now doing this as an online assessment at the beginning. We also have the alternate for ELLs that will be administered. We sorry, my phone's going off over here. It talks at the very bottom in that highlighted section what accommodations a student will be afforded based on the results of this test for other state testings. And it says that any student that scores below 5.0 bridging in the reading subtest will qualify for accommodations for other state tests. The area of assessment for the English language proficiency, if you look on page 3 at the top, you see where I've highlighted the different divided clusters. We have kindergarten, which is all paper pencil this year. You have grade 1, grade 2, 3, grades 4, 5, grades 6 through 8, and then of course your high school grades 9 through 12. The next box down covers paper pencil assessments, which we are only giving if it becomes necessary based on a student's accommodations. Continue to go down, you'll see for each grade level cluster there is a test in each of the 4 domains: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. All parts of the online assessment are computer delivered, with the exception for the writing for grades 1 through 3. Those students in grades 1 through 3 will perform their writing paper pencil. Then at the bottom it talks about the differences between the 2 domains. One thing that was mentioned during our training is that Mark and Book does not require a paper pencil test. The Mark and Book accommodation is when a student has troubles translating his answer from a test book to an answer sheet. In this test, the answer choices are contained in the online screen, so there's no need to do a paper pencil solely based on Mark and Book accommodation. Moving on. If you'll look at those accommodations or the key differences, you will see the difference between the online and the paper pencil. Now the state testing window, as you have been notified that the state testing window was extended by 2 weeks, so now instead of the deadline being March the 4th, it is now March the 25th. And that's because of the delay in the headsets. And in our training on Friday, they again reiterated that Their intent was to have them to us last week. Their intent was to have them to us this week, but we still have no definite answer if they will even come this week. As soon as we know for sure that they're coming, we'll notify Ben and he can notify the schools. And we'll make a decision on how to distribute those headsets. Keep in mind, though, the headsets with the microphones are only required with the microphone for the speaking. If you have headsets in your school that can be used for the listening part, you can use those headsets. You do not have to wait on the ones with the microphone. Your test scheduling schedule and access for AILS 2.0 has all been entered. So your windows are available now. On the next page, you'll see the writing 1 and 2-3 test and the speaking test, pre-A test, are exceptions to the policy. Administrations for the grades 1 through 3 writing tests must be separated into test sessions by both the grade level and the tier. So you can't mix those groups up. You have to keep them separated in those administrations. Test sessions for grades 1 through 3 writing cannot be combined with writing tests for grades 4, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12, which we have no all-inclusive schools with all grade levels, so that should not be a problem. Students taking the speaking tier pre-A test should be administered the speaking test separately from students taking the tier A and tier BC speaking test.
And just to clarify that, you won't know who's taking those tests until after the students have done the reading and listening. Remember, this year we didn't have to do tiers because the reading and listening test will determine those tiers. So once they've taken the reading and listening test, you'll get a list of students out of the WIDA AMS that will tell you which students are doing what. So it's going to require you to be a little flexible with your scheduling. You've got your test window and you've got your dates, but how your grouping formats look and the amount of time it takes for those different sessions will be a work in progress as students take the first portions of the test.
And as you form your groups together, keep in mind here the number of students scheduled in a test session or a test site will depend on how manageable that group is by the test administrator and by the observing proctor. Okay, moving on to the rest of the information that's here. I've stated in the emails, while we're not going to go line by line in this book, you are required to study and understand each and every piece of information that's in these guides. Now on page 6, we see the note says, please allot an additional 15 minutes to these times for convening and distributing and collecting materials. As you see the timing there in the block above that, tells you what your time limits or what your time sessions will incorporate for these tests for each one: listening, reading, speaking, writing, and writing tier BC. Okay. Moving on page 7, at the very bottom of the page, you'll see there are the contact numbers if you should need help. So any questions concerning test administrator or training accounts and accommodations, you can call help at WIDA or email help@WIDA.us or call that number. Again, if you're not accessing or you have not received an email to give you access to the training, check with me first and I'll go in and check it and if necessary reset you. Also, any questions about technology should be referred to WIDA at datarecognitioncorporation.com or that number there quoted, 855-787-9615.
We would really like you to keep the support in-house if we can, just because it helps us know what questions are coming. We've had a number of people call WIDA and get good information that's helped us as well. But we just want to make sure that if you call WIDA, that you share that with the group so that we can make sure and get that out to everyone.
And moving on to page 8, this is the policy and procedures according to North Carolina. Keep in mind, there are certain procedures and policies which WIDA has as it applies to the consortium. There are many, many states within the consortium who will be administering this test, but North Carolina produces this policy and procedure guide for the exceptions. So keep in mind, anytime you're looking anything up in your administrative manuals with WIDA, also refer to this documentation for any state policies and procedures. Okay, moving on to page 9. Okay, it talks about the comprehensive objective composite. It also talks about previously identified LAP students according to the policy. Students previously identified as LAP who have exited LAP identification during the last 2 years shall be included in the school's calculations for determining the annual measurable objectives of the LAP subgroup if the subgroup already meet the minimum number of 30 students required for a subgroup and the inclusion is necessary to achieve the target. This actually has absolutely nothing to do with the administration of the test, but it's the information to let you know that students who have exited the program within the last 2 years may be used to help the schools meet their AMO targets. Test security. As with all state tests, all test materials are considered secure materials and must be kept under lock and key, and there must be a process by which the test coordinator will distribute those materials out to the test administrators if need be. The test tickets which you will produce at your school when time is needed, those test tickets must be distributed to students, must be taken back up from the students, and returned to your test coordinator. They are considered secure test materials. So please have a way to keep track of those test tickets and make sure that when you're all said and done, you have all of them.
All right, we're going to pause real quick. I know we've had a number of people with some audio issues. I see a little bit of back and forth about that. I will get a response to some of you folks in text because obviously you can't hear me if I'm speaking and you have audio problems, but I see who those folks are. Definitely as we continue to go through this, we've got this website here that I told you about earlier, and I see a number of people popping questions into that. Make sure those questions pop there. Let me give you the website again. If you go to that padlet.com/benallred73/access, as you come up with questions, I know that the WIDA AMS and generating those tickets is going to be one of those things that's a little angst the first time, but once you do it for the first session, it probably won't be that big of a deal. But if you have questions about what Steve's saying or about what we're talking about, if you'll please just make sure and populate those in the website below. We'll be able to answer those when he's done talking. We wanted to make sure we had something that you could access later, and then as we're done, we can go back through and either answer those questions for you in real time or follow up with those questions later.
Okay, as we continue on with the guide, test security, the same emphasis is placed on test security for this test as any other state test. Moving on to page 10. At the bottom of page 10, it refers to the Testing Code of Ethics, by which a copy is in the very back of this guide, and everything about the Testing Code of Ethics. As with any other test, as test coordinators or test administrators, you are to read through those Testing Code of Ethics and be familiar with them. You'll see on page 11, it talks about the statement of obtaining academic credit through fraudulent means. It talks about accounting and for storing materials. All this is the same for this assessment as it is for any other state assessment. Continuing on page 12, there's responsibility for accurate coding and completing of test materials. And then the requirement to report student goals. You'll see in that last line, school system shall report scores resulting from the administration of the district-wide and state-mandated tests to students and parents or guardians along with available score interpretation information within 30 days from the generation of the score at the school system level or receive the scores interpretation documentation from DPI. So we have a legal obligation that once we receive the scores from these tests that we're to produce copies and provide them to the students and the parents. The next section talks about suspended students and our obligation to test or not to test those students. Then we'll move on to page 13. We talk about student emergencies. It is wise to afford every student the opportunity to go to the restroom prior to testing. However, if a need does arise where a student must leave the test site and go to the restroom, we deem it necessary that they be escorted from the test site to the restroom and back. Also, no more than one person per time unless you have multiple individuals who can escort them. So please keep all this in mind. Only one student at a time from a test site. Now, the big item, of course, is the prohibited items. We've dealt with this for a couple of years now. No electronic devices may be in the student's possession during testing. This includes cell phones, smartwatches, any item by which a student can use to make a copy of the screen or anything like that. They're not to have it in their possession. It's not a matter of whether or not they use it. It's if it's in their possession. So at the point of testing, or the testing has concluded, and that student should stand up and you see that they have a cell phone on their person, it is an automatic misadministration. If you notice a student during the testing with a cell phone or any electronic device that's prohibited, you're to remove the student immediately from the test site, and it is a misadministration. So keep a close watch on that. Continuing on through, you'll see the information about violations and testing irregularities. While anything that is listed in this section will cause an irregularity, it does not necessitate that it will be a misadministration. However, when anything occurs that's contrary to the rules and the regulations and the policies for administering test occurs, you must call me at my number, 704-262-4422, and notify us in Accountability Services of the irregularity. Be sure to have as many of the facts as you have so that we can make a decision on whether it will become a misadministration or not.
I just wanted to add to that. Many times you're sitting in a test session and you're trying to make a determination. This is a new test. We know that there will be some questions. It is better to report an irregularity that ends up being nothing than to not report it and invalidate the entire test session. If we deal with it in progress, many times you can get an answer and it's no misadministration. But if we wait till after the full test is over, sometimes there's nothing we can do. So better to err on the side of caution, especially with the new assessment. And that's true for me for EOCs, EOGs, and anything. But that's just good practice.
Yes, and emails are not immediate notification. We need the phone call, please. If there should be a misadministration, now on page 15, there is only one form of this test, and therefore we must wait 5 days to re-administer the test. School system must wait 5 days to re-administer the test to the student if a misadministration is declared. So please keep that in mind. There will be no availability to reset a student's test and restart the test on the same day. We must wait the 5 days. And I will check on that because that had changed for other tests to be 5 calendar days. And I'll need to check to see if this is 5 work days or 5 calendar days. And of course, at the bottom, it talks about the confidentiality of the student scores. Moving on to the roles and responsibilities, it begins with the LA test coordinator's roles and responsibilities. And at the top of the next page, this is something we have not done before, but apparently we're going to do it for this test. Normally when we do a training session with the test coordinators, there is a sign-in sheet, and at the top of the sign-in sheet, everything that's in this North Carolina Test Security Agreement is in there, and by signing that training sheet, we do not have to have individual sheets signed. Seeing that we are doing this via a webinar, we're going to have to require that this sheet be signed, and all the test coordinators were emailed a copy of this today. So please take care of that for me, test coordinators.
Do they need to keep those on file at the school level only, or do you need a copy in your office?
We're going to have the schools keep a copy and forward us a copy so that we can put them in a file.
Okay. So what we'd probably rather do is have you collect all of those first instead of sending them one at a time.
Yes,
Yeah.
collect them all at one time. They can be returned when you return your test materials. So you don't have to start sending them in now. Just go ahead and take care of it at your school. And at the end, when you're returning materials to us, then you will return those also. This, just to go ahead and mention, the state had mentioned last year that they were going to become more involved with auditing the school systems and the individual schools as far as policies and procedures go. We've had a couple of audits already. Some of them are just desk audits where all we have to do is send in the information. Others were an actual site visit for one school. So keep in mind that as the U.S. Department of Ed starts to require more evidence that we're following what we say we're following, these audits may become more and more frequent. Okay, on page 18, talk about ensure for access, ELLs 2.0 talks about ensuring all materials and packages are shipped. Any paper pencil materials that are distributed to school will come back to Accountability Services. We will check them in and we'll prepare the boxes for shipping back. It continues on with the roles for the LAP coordinator. Moving on to page 20, the school test coordinator's role and responsibilities. And I do want to mention that also within these roles and responsibilities, these are not all inclusive. Your principal and your administrative staff may put additional requirements upon you, and they have the right to do that. Okay. Page 21, it talks about the test administrator qualifications, and I especially want to hit the last bullet. They must complete all test administrative training and certification of completion requirements for the Access for ELS 2.0, which is all online.
And I do want to, we've had a number of questions that came up, and it's a good time to answer it about the proctors. If you have a proctor that's only going to be with you during, say, the reading test, that proctor does not need to take every section of that. But the questions come up, how do we certify, quote unquote, that they've done that? I think that's a matter of just keeping that in-house with your test coordinator. Obviously, to get the certification through WIDA, you have to complete every bit of it. That's feedback that we'll have to give to NCDPI regarding the way that test training is set up. But you do not have to have your proctors complete the entire training if they're only going to be proctoring for one section.
Moving on to page 22, the top box talks about administering and proctoring the Access for ELS 2.0 paper listening, and it goes through and tells what is required. And then the test administrator's responsibilities begin there under that on page 22, and goes and continues through the bottom of page 23. You also have a technology coordinator's responsibilities, which will be handled through the technology department. Of course, your tech facilitators will be involved as well. Now on page 24, we're going to get into the proctor responsibilities. And it says that the test publisher requires any adult helping to proctor the online or paper access test must take the appropriate training course before proctoring and administration. The training course content is separated into 4 components, one for each assessment. The number of components that are required for proctors to train depends on the assessment they will be proctored. So as Ben just said, it's only for those areas which they're proctoring that they need to complete that. The state's requirement is that a trained proctor should be assigned and present for each test administration regardless of the number of students. That is the ultimate goal, is to have a proctor for every test site. However, on page 25, it goes into the use of roving proctors, which we're familiar with because we began using those last year. One of the conditions that we need clarification on is the second bullet, which says Well, let's just do it. A roving proctor should be used to monitor only the following test administrations. Administrations in which the test administrator is not the teacher of record. And we're going to have to get some clarification on that with the ESL teachers.
Yeah, we know that an ESL teacher on a schedule, students go see them, and there is some variations between the levels, elementary, middle, and high school, and whether grades are assigned and what that looks like. So we're going to get clarification for you on what teacher of record means in the vein of this test.
And the second bullet says administrations in which the test administrator is not a teacher of the subject matter. So for any other state test, in order to use a roving proctor, the teacher cannot be the teacher of record, nor do they teach the subject matter. So we'll get some clarifications for that. Of course, the rest of the bullets are just like any other roving proctor for any other state test. They have to be trained. They cannot be responsible for more than 3 test sites. There should be no more than 30 students in a test site. And there is a process by which they move through those test sites quietly until the test is completed. Moving on to page 26. It talks about the training components, and that's through page 27. It also talks about the certification requirements. Now we're going to move into page 28, the roles and responsibilities following the test. It goes through the test system coordinator, the LAP coordinator on page 29, with the responsibilities that we have. And then on page 30, it talks about the pre-ID labels. Now, in the past, we've asked that a pre-ID label not be affixed to any test until the morning of testing. But I think it's pretty clear who's going to be taking this test. So if you need to prepare your materials and apply those labels for your kindergartners, it's perfectly all right. Moving on through that, we're going to go over to page 32. That gives you another screenshot. And then page 33 is how to code a test booklet which you do not have a pre-ID. And you just follow that directions. You fill in everything as you see in this sample. If there's an X, that information is not required. You only fill in the sections on the test booklet that this sample does not have it X'd out. So please do that. And there's also information that has to be filled out on the back as well. Demographic information, I believe.
Real quick, I'm seeing a lot of questions come in regarding proctors and accounts. So I will put it back up on the screen when we finish this part, but there is a place where you can, of course, request credentials for logins. Proctors would need to have access to that as well, and we can provide them credentials for that. The other questions are coming in regarding administrations with one-on-one and kindergarten. In the manual, it states that every test session, regardless of the number of students, requires a proctor, just like if we were giving an EOC or an EOG. And this is a difference in previous years of access implementation, not just from the online perspective, but the fact that it's now under the same covering, I guess you could say, of all state tests. We will just make sure and ask that question for you to see if there's any leniency or any variation. But from what we can tell in the manual and the trainings we've had so far, if you're given an assessment, it requires an administrator and a proctor for every session, whether it's 1 student or 25 students.
Okay, moving on to page 34, there are more samples of how to fill out the information that is needed if you do not have a pre-ID label. Page 36 talks about entering the information in the do not score sections. And toward the bottom of that page, there is a note. Any of these codes are marked on the test booklet. No score will be included for the domain and the data file sent to the state. So anything that is a do not score will not receive a score. Now we're going to move on to page 38. And it talks about preparation for the test. It begins by talking about preparing the students for testing. Before the test administration date, teachers should discuss with the students the purpose of the test administration, Must inform them that they are not to share test items with others, such as students or teachers. Teachers are not allowed to discuss test items with the students. Must not use test items or information from students as a basis for additional instruction or review. Excerpts from the test must not be used at any time during classroom instruction or in resource materials such as study guides. And then in the next section, you'll see there's highlighted using the Access 2.0 test domains. That's for the online only, and completing the required practice test items for online. Of course, that falls under before the designated test administration date, and according to state board policy, teachers may help students improve test taking skills by following those pointed items.
So this is obviously a really big piece, making sure that your students have access to the test, the practice piece. I know some of you have done that in your ESL classrooms over the last month. I know at some schools I've gotten information that you're doing that this week, and you're doing it 1 week prior to your test administration. However you do that, make sure you just follow the protocols. You've got links to the online practice test, but just understand it's required. It's not optional. All students must go through a practice session through that demo before they test.
Okay. The note below there, Access test demos are designed to be viewed by students on days before taking the Access online test, so therefore you cannot do it on the day of the test. Do the demos prior to. The practice items required access for EL 2.0 online test practice items requires every student participating in the Access 2.0 online test to complete Access 2.0 online test practice items at least one time at the school before test day. Students should not complete the practice items on the day of test again. And the test practice can only be accessed from Insight using the Insight desktop icon from the students' desktops, laptops, or tablets, which we're not using any tablets. No tablets. Desktops and laptops, Chromebooks, no tablets. Okay, so page 39 moves on. Again, it talks about the student's test tickets, which must be provided to the student to access the test. And again, that very last line says test tickets are to be securely destroyed upon the completion of all test sessions. So when you produce those tickets, make sure everyone that goes out comes back and then you securely destroy them. The test environment, as with any other test, you need to sanitize your test room so that there's absolutely nothing in there could tend to lead a student to select a correct answer. It's the same for, and you can do that by removing or covering up. Page 40 goes into the ordering of test materials, which was completed by a file submitted by DPI for all our requirements for test materials. There was an excess of 10% sent to us, which we have in our office. If you should need additional paper pencil materials, just contact us. There has been a question about the tiers and not having enough writing books for grades 1 through 3. They used a mathematical way of determining, based on this test and these other test administrations, of how many of each one of those tiers they sent us. Again, 10% overage is not a lot. So if we should run into a problem and need to order more tests, I will need you to notify me so I can place those additional writing tests on order by those tiers. Again, on page, moving on to...
Real quick, I just wanted to say, when it comes to ordering test materials, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can call Steve directly. You can send an email. But also feel free to use that feedback form. Steve and I have that set up so that as soon as you drop it in that feedback form, we get a notification. And that does two things. One is it keeps it recorded so we can share that with other folks. And two, it gives us just one more way that two of us get a notification. So feel free to call, feel free to email, feel free to text. But we'd really like you to use that feedback form because it really helps us keep track of the requests and the number and frequency that are coming in.
The bottom page 40 talks about the equipment and technology is handling the setups at all the schools for the use of the computers that will be used for this testing. Page 41, and it continues here again, talks about students marking the test book for paper, and this is only for the paper test. This is just going through and reiterating our policies for transferring and scribing over to an answer document for the students' responses. And this is, you use the same thing for any paper pencil test. Of course, with us being online, there'll be very few of these administrations. So if there should be a student who's receiving a paper pencil test with marking book, these are the guidelines for transferring the answers that are marked in the test book to the answer document. Page 42 goes on and talks about the correct bubbling procedure for paper tests. So is also on 43, 44. Now page 45 goes into test administration procedures and accommodations, the accessibility tools. There in the second section, accessibility tools. The following accessibility tools are approved by the state and are available to all ELLs taking the Access 2.0. Accessibility tools do not need to be pre-selected in the student record in the WIDA assessment management system. These tools may be embedded in the online test or provided by ELLs by administrators for online testing. Students must complete the practice test items on days before the test, so these tools do not become a distraction. So they need to have an opportunity to see how these work in the system. And it goes through and notates those online administrations and those accessibility tools.
So this is going to be one of those things that I think will inform much in the future, and specifically things around IEPs and 504s. As you look at those accessibility tools, you'll see lots of things in there that we might think that we have to add into an accommodation through an IEP or a 504, which are going to be available to all students. So I know that EC folks are listening in today and are looking at that, and we'll have the next calendar year to get really good at what goes in an IEP and a 504 plan. But I'll be working with Lori Lee and EC to make sure that we've got some really good stuff for you as we work through this in the future.
Moving on to page 46, test administration procedures. It goes through here and lists the following chart indicates the test administration procedures that are either approved or not approved by the state. If approved, the procedures are available to all ELLs taking Access 2.0 provided that all standardized test and security requirements are met. These test procedures do not change what the test items are designated to measure, nor do they change the way the test scores are interpreted. So you go through this list and it tells you what is allowable and what is not. The biggest thing every year that we get is about our hard of hearing or deaf students and the use of that interpreter. And I've had a discussion with a high school this morning, and this has been a point of contention every year, but it's not allowed. They're not allowed to sign anything, not even the directions. In the copy that you're probably looking at, scroll down, I think I highlighted those areas and went back, maybe not. So just keep that in mind. This guide overrules anything that's in the WIDA Administration Manual. In the WIDA Administration Manual, it says that you may sign or interpret the directions and the test itself, but North Carolina does not allow that. Okay? So please keep that in mind. Page 47, it begins to talk about the accommodations available with an IEP or Section 504 plan. So that's your EC and 504 students. So it goes through the accommodations which are applicable for those tests in your Appendix B. Students with transitory impairments. A transitory impairment is when a medical situation arises with a student for which is determined will probably not last more than 6 months. So a lot of these have to do with your students who come in and they've broken a writing hand, or they've broken a member or part of their body, and it dictates that we have to adjust how we test the student based on that temporary impairment. So when that situation arises, your transitory impairment team should decide what accommodations, based on what is proved, that that student can be afforded to be able to complete the test administration. And that works the same way for this test as it would for any other state test. It also covers the notes that students who do not have an IEP Section 504 or transitory impairment documentation must not receive accommodations on the Access 2.0. Bottom, it talks about large print braille materials. That's covering paper pencil where needed. Order special print versions. If it's necessary to order any of these special print versions, it has to be requested. The deadline for the request is now March 11th and not March 4th.
So this question's come up very, very rarely because of the low incidence of the population that would need it. I think what you have to decide if you're a IEP team member, or if you're looking at whether or not large print and Braille are required. Braille is pretty self-explanatory. I think that's fairly obvious. The accessibility tools for large print may be enough for some students, but you'll need to look at that, and so you do have some time between now and March 11th to make those decisions. If you have specific questions about what to do or need some feedback, please just let Steve or me know.
Top of page 49 talks about accommodation notification requests. Any accommodation that's written into an IEP or 504 plan which is not listed in the approved list of accommodations, a written request via electronic request, it has to be sent.
Getting some feedback that the screen disappeared, so let me see if I can unshare it and then bring it back up for you. All right, looks like we just had it drop off for a second. I don't know exactly where that happened. I will let you know that any screen loss will come back when we do the recording, because the recording is happening just off my computer, so it'll record whatever's on the screen. If someone in the chat could tell me the last screen you saw, looks like that was at 12:16, so it was only 3 minutes ago. So I assume we just lost a little bit. Hope the screen's back up now. And we're looking at review of accommodations used during testing, which is page 49.
Okay, the review of accommodations used during testing forms. We will pre-populate those this afternoon from the information that's contained in CCAS. However, we cannot produce for 504. Those are only contained in PowerSchool, and you will need to construct those using a template manually at the school. Do want to note that as you see there, one form is to be completed per test per student per subtest. So for all 4 domains, you will have a review of accommodation sheet. Those sheets remain at the school. They're to be used by the IEP and 504 teams in conjunction with their meetings to aid them in determining their use of those accommodations in future tests. Test administrators are responsible for recording whether the student did or did not use those accommodations, and of course that they were provided. Again, it talks about described responses on page 49. Students will document documentation in the current IEP 504 who record the response in a manner other than the computer or regular answer document. Provision of accommodations dictate to scribe, large print, braille, all that. It goes into the processes by which those answers get recorded. Now you're with page 50. Of course, it talks about the scores and using the scores and the reports that will be received.
I do want to mention I've had a couple of questions about whether or not the scores will come back any quicker because the test is online. Obviously, something is getting scored for a student that does the reading and listening for them to be placed in the appropriate tier for the speaking and writing. Unfortunately, we've gotten no indication that the actual scores and score reports that we use to make determinations for next school year and for placing students and notifying parents and all of those things will be any sooner. Of course, if we find that out, we'll all be thrilled and we'll let you know. But at this point, we've got no indication that they'll be earlier.
Okay, so that finished up the main section of the guide. We'll move on to page 51, which is appendices. Appendix A is North Carolina alternate access for ELLs. We do have 20-some students who will be administered the alternate. And the process for those is talked about here, talks about the features, the eligibility criteria, and those students who are in the extended content standards who would normally take an Extend 1 test would take the alternate access for ELLs. The only students who are not required, of course, are your kindergartners. Kindergartners are not included. This is only grades 1 through 12 who are in the extended content standards will be eligible to take this test. Now, those materials were included in what you picked up. However, again, if we do have additional materials, if somehow a student was missed in the original upload from DPI, let us know so that we can get you another set of what you will need.
And so I want to reiterate something Steve said because it comes up frequently. There are a number of eligibility criteria to determine whether a student goes on the alternate access. But you start with extended content standards. If the student is not participating in extended content standards, they are not going to take the alternate access. And so it means you don't have to look at the other 4 criteria. But if a student is on extended content standards, then you get to make a determination. It is not automatic, but it is typical.
Okay, Appendix B begins to go into the accommodations which are available. And you'll see Appendix B covers the online assessment. Those are all your accommodations, and you'll see there in the middle where it's allowed or not, it says yes or no. Now I do want to move to page 56, and under the extended speaking test response time, it says yes, speaking only. We were told during our training that if they have extended time in any of the domains, they may have extended time for all domains of the test. Appendix C covers your paper pencil administrations and those accommodations which are approved or not approved, or allowed or not allowed. There is one thing in the verbiage on the bottom of page 59, and I probably should go back and find the other pages. But in the very last line on page 59, it says, verbally redirect the student's attention to the test. This is talking about keeping the students engaged in the test. And it gives you the outline for what you can and cannot do. It says, verbally redirect the student's attention to the test. In English or in the student's native language, the in English or should be marked through. And I will go back and find the other locations in the guide and send you that in an email. Last but absolutely not least is the testing code of ethics. These are the code of ethics which we must administer tests by and that we must keep our thoughts upon, and make sure that every individual who's involved in testing must read completely through these testing code of ethics. That is required by the state now for every testing window and every test that we administer.
Good, and I think that's a perfect time to reiterate just the importance of testing manuals. They are voluminous, as is the conversation around them that we're required to do, just like we just did. But most, if not all, questions that we get, we find the answers to back in the manuals, and we're more than happy to be that resource to answer those questions and point you in the right direction. really appreciate Steve going to training on Friday and highlighting the sections in this manual for you. I will make sure and send you the highlighted version so that you have those to access. If you're familiar at all with PDF or any kind of Acrobat reader, you'll be able to filter it and search quickly by those highlighted sections. But I just want to make sure you understand that the highlighted sections and going through trainings like this and hearing the high points and hearing the clarification really is no replacement for actually reading those yourself. It takes a lot of time, but it really does give you the information you need.
And just to add to that, we always provide the schools with the electronic version of the manuals as soon as they become available. But note that we will always be providing a paper pencil copy to the test coordinators during our regular trainings. So it is not necessary for you to print out the electronic copies. You will be receiving, your school will be receiving a paper pencil copy of any administrative guide that's provided by the state.
So I'm quickly kind of going back through and seeing if we caught the messages. Erica Williard has been wonderful today. She's helping us record and been piping in some of the technical difficulties from another room. Let me quickly scan through. So there's a question that says, if you share a teacher, does the teacher need to sign both schools' form? And that's around the test administrator testing code of ethics form. Do you want one from each school?
It only needs to be signed once. I would just notate at the bottom that the schools they cover.
Okay. It's not a hard thing to sign two forms, of course, but if you do teach at more than one school, as an ESL teacher, please make sure that you provide the test coordinator at each school with a copy of that or just notification that you've done a form. Matthew did note for us that the ESL teacher is defined as the teacher of record, and so that will negate roving proctors for those sessions. I know some of you with larger schools with multiple testing sessions over multiple weeks, thinking about Weddington Hills and Irvin and Furr and the like. I'm sure I'll be getting some phone calls from you, as will Steve, and we'll talk through that and see what we can work out. We don't make the rules, but we'll try to work within the constraints that we have. I see a couple of things about not receiving the roster that Steve mentioned via email. Anything that we mentioned, whether it be the signed form or anything that we talked about in this webinar, we'll make sure that we send a copy of that along with anything. Just got word that maybe the PowerPoint is not showing. So I'm going to try to switch that and make sure that comes back on. Okay, so Lori Lee piped in on the left with the chat that says if an accommodation is not used due to the format of the testing, it is suggested that the following comment be added on the sheet. And the sheet that she's talking about is the review of accommodation sheet. And she says test administration format did not allow for the use of this accommodation. Thank you, Lori. The reason that's important is because as an IEP team makes a determination on whether to continue the use of an accommodation, we don't want the team thinking the student chose not to use it, but that the setting did not allow it. That's a big difference for IEP teams. Thank you. Karen asked, can we redirect students using English, or do we have to use their native language? We'll check on that. Okay. I'm going to move through this PowerPoint. Can someone please at the bottom on the chat let me know whether or not you can see my screen so I can move through those? Still here, just trying to work through that technical glitch of the PowerPoint. I'm going to remove that PowerPoint and add a new PowerPoint back in. So give me just a second. All right, I've reshared that. Can someone please let me know if you can see my screen now? The beauty of technology. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share my desktop and I'm going to open the PowerPoint and we'll go through it that way. I have no fancy transitions, so we should be okay. How about now? Looks good. Okay, wonderful. So the feedback tools are still here. I want to cover the issue of headsets. We've gotten word from a number of schools that you've ordered some, and thank you for doing that. That relieves the pressure on all of us and ensures that you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. We are expecting delivery of around 160 sets based on one headset per every 10 students. I checked with Steve this morning, and we have no confirmation of when those will come. I've included a link in here for you about the specifications, and if you want to order your own, you can do so. I'll share the PowerPoint with you and all of the links will work, so you don't have to feverishly write them down. There have been a number of questions that have come up regarding the order of the test, like what order you have to give it in and whether you can combine tests on one day. I have found nothing that says that you have to give the listening and reading on different days. What the manual is very clear on is they should not be combined into one test session. So it would be perfectly okay to have a student take the listening test in the morning, take an appropriate break. I don't know what that is, but I would assume 15 minutes or so, and then come back in for another test session. But the student must be afforded that break. You do need to split it up so that the listening and reading happen on one day, the speaking happens on another day, and the writing on the third day. Doesn't matter whether speaking comes first or writing comes first. They can go in either order. The manual recommends that speaking comes first and then writing, but it's also very specific that it doesn't matter. Given the delay in the headsets, some of you may want to do the writing test first, but hopefully we'll have more information on that today or tomorrow. I wanted to give one more plug for the accommodations. There are really only 3 accommodations that need to be keyed into the WIDA AMS. I've listed those here. Those have gone out in multiple emails. If you have any questions, please make sure you talk to your EC lead teacher, EC teacher at your school, Lori Lee. Send those to our feedback form or contact Steve or me directly to make sure that we do that. We know that entering those accommodations has been kind of a bear. On a side note, I did send out an email, but I wanted to throw this out there one more time. Students were loaded, then over the weekend, a week and a half ago or so, accommodations populated for a number of students. We still have not gotten word about where those accommodations came from. We checked those against our elevation database for ESL students. We've checked that against PowerSchool. We cannot find a place where accommodations align. So if you are at a school with multiple ESL students, 50, 60, 70 students, it may be easier for you to clear all the accommodations and only add them back for the students who need them versus checking every single student. We can do that on a per school basis. And all Steve or I need is a request from you to clear them. I will then email you back saying, are you sure? And then after that, we'll clear them for you. We don't want to make a mistake on that. Transfer students. We know that English language learners in our district, as with all students, transfer between schools. It happens. Please do not delete students. If you'll just notify Steve that the student is no longer at your school, Steve will make a determination by checking PowerSchool to see if they're at another school in our district. If you know what school the student transferred to in our district, or if they transferred to CMS or another district, that's obviously very helpful, but please do not delete students from the WIDA AMS. Amy Peters, assistant principal over at Weddington Hill Elementary School. They serve almost 200 ESL students, so their test administrations for all things are quite large. She provided us some things that she's learned just in trying to implement this undertaking for access testing. So I put a bulleted list of a number of things that she found. I'll let you review those as you go through this PowerPoint on your own. But I really appreciate the effort that a lot of you have put into finding out the best way to give this. We're all learning together, and we'll get some feedback post-test in March about what worked and what didn't work and what we need to elevate for feedback to the state and to WIDA, and then also to us about how to make this a better test administration in the future. You can contact Steve or me at the email addresses below. And that is my cell phone number, and I know people have a weird thing about cell phones, but just call it, because that's about the only phone I use. You can text me as well. Steve's number is his office number. I will not give out his cell phone number unless you read his emails, which is in there as well. It's in the signature on both of our emails. But feel free to email us or text or call with any questions that you have. I'm going to switch over quickly to the Padlet. There were a number of questions in there, and I just want to run through those. Some I had the answers to, and some I did not. So questions came up about proctors. Do we need them? Yes, for every session. We've not found anything that says otherwise. There was a question about combining the paper tests, tiers B and C for your grades 1 and grades 2 and 3. On page 5 of the manual, it says that grade 1 to 3 writing tests must be separated, so you cannot combine those. There was a question about test session creation, about who has to do that. Steve and I are going to have to follow up on that question, but we'll make sure and post that in this link. And if you want to go back to that question and put in your specific contact information, we'll make sure you get it as well as everyone else. I answered the question about deleting students. Please don't do that. I will have to read this question and follow up in the manual to make sure I give a good answer about combining students in different grades and tiers. I can say this, there are instances where it is okay to combine students on different tiers and different grades, as long as it's not inside that grades 1 through 3. But I will answer that specifically for this question. Middle school and high schools should have it quite easy because you can combine so many students in the same session. There's a question about a student's one-on-one. Can that person sit in addition to the test administrator and proctor, or whether they should be the proctor for the session?
Which is that?
Read this question, Steve.
If the one-on-one is not involved in the administration, they may be the proctor. So in other words, they're not signing or queuing, which we can't do anyway. I do not see why they cannot be the proctor.
So in that question, they could be a third person or the proctor. Either one would be okay.
Either one's fine.
There's a question about letters to send home. Steve went to a training on Friday, and we got a number of letters. I'll review those today and make sure you get copies of those to send home. Good. Test coordinators also receive those via email, so you could get those from your test coordinator as well, but we'll send those out. Testing tickets. Steve, who should be creating test tickets? Should that be the test administrator or the test coordinator?
I'll have to look at the permissions, but I believe it's the test coordinator who will be able to do those tickets, but I'll have to check.
We'll check with that, and we'll put a more thorough response in that blank. For 4th and 5th grade, in the testing session for writing, do we need to mark do not score because the student is taking it on paper? Now, we may have to follow up on that because in 4th and 5th grade, students should be taking the online version of the test. So if you're making a determination that the student is going to take the paper version instead of the online version, you do have the authority to do that, but I want to kind of go out there and say that should be the exception rather than the rule. The vast majority of students should be taking the online administration. So if you have specific instances where you want students to take the paper version, please let your test coordinator know, but we'll look at the specific question and make sure it gets answered. There have been a couple of questions about the documents Steve mentioned around the agreements to sign. Those went out to test coordinators, but I will send a global email out to the list I've been sending and make sure this PowerPoint and all documents are attached to that. If proctors need access to the training, please fill out the credentials request form that's in the PowerPoint, and we'll make sure they get logins. There's a question that says, is there a limit of the number of days between testing the different domains? I've not seen anything that says anything about the number of days, only that each test session must be its own test session, which means there must be a break between them, but nothing that says that it's okay. I assume the question, my assumption would be, we want to do all of the listening and reading and then do all of the speaking later, which means a student who takes the listening on day 1 won't take the speaking for 5 or 6 days. That is okay. If all testing coordinators don't have a testing guide, we will make sure they have one by the end of the day today, so that you'll have that. And last question that's up here for now, to clarify, are we supposed to have the proctors go through the whole administrator training? You only need to have your proctors go through the portion of the training that they'll be proctoring for. I know that when you log into WIDA US, you have to choose one of 2 things, test administrator or test coordinator. We'll give that feedback to NCDPI and ask that they put a test proctor section there. This is one of those weird things where it's a national test that we're applying at the state level, which comes with all kinds of restrictions and exceptions and clarifications. But they will need to log in, choose test administrator, and then just choose the sections that they want. I know that there was a question about, are we going to get this PowerPoint? Yes, you will get the PowerPoint, not a problem. It'll come as an attachment, and there will also be a link to this, what is now a fairly lengthy video. So as you want to watch this back again, it'll be about 1 hour and 15 minutes, and apologize for that, but it's a lot of information to share. And I saw one other question that says, what if we already sent letters home? When you get the letters today, I know some of you sent a letter home that testing was coming up, which you should have done. I appreciate you being forward thinking as we're trying to figure this out. If you will just compare the letters that you receive with the one you sent home, if you feel like you need to give more information to parents, send home another letter. If you feel like it's sufficient, then you're okay. I think we're all professionals and can make that decision. If you need help making that decision, just let us know. All right. The link to the Padlet will stay up, and we will add answers to that and make sure that link stays active. We will send all of this information out to you, and I appreciate everyone's attention, especially with the new format. We worked through a few kinks, but I think everything worked out just fine. At this time, we're going to end the webinar, and thank you so much. Forward those questions and keep them coming through the feedback loops. You have a great day. Okay, you're good.
Yeah, yes, they can redirect students' attention back to the assessment in English.
In English. She asked about it
Only.
in Spanish.
Only
So we
in
need to-
English. You cannot do it it says not permitted. I don't know if I said not permitted
That's
or
okay.
not.
Well, we'll make sure that they get that.
That's why they marked it through.
So I'm wondering if, can I get a copy of the transcript once I end this? I recorded the screen, so it's all there.